today we are going to be talking with Ross Mutton from Ottawa, Ontario, who is one of the AMTEC elders, memory keepers. And before we start, I'm going to share screen and we will look at the copyright waiver. And Ross, hang on here. Can you see that?
I can.
All right. So I don't know if you want to take a few moments to read, or we sent it to you before, and if you're happy to agree without reservation.
Yes, I read it when you sent it to me, and I agree without reservation.
Okay. Now I'm going to unshare. Stop share. There we go. Okay. So Cindy, you may have to help me out if I lose my voice here, which I'm doing.
You bet, of course.
Oh, now I lost my intro sheet. Oh, okay. Oh dear.
You want me to do the intro paragraph there,
Do you
Chris?
mind?
Well,
Yeah,
not at all, not at all. So I want to welcome everybody to the AMTEC History Series, where we talk to leaders and memory keepers for the Association for Media and Technology and Education in Canada, an organization that began in the early 1970s. AMTEC was a driving force for the use of educational technology in the classrooms of Canada until it dissolved and partnered with the Canadian Association of Distance Education in 2007 to become what is currently known as the Canadian Network for Innovation in Education, or CNIE. This series is a part of the AMTEC History Project, which we began in 2021. The project was created to recognize the pioneers of educational technology in Canada and to promote the stories and past experiences of these pioneers. My name is Cindy Ives, and I am currently a professor of distance education at Athabasca University. My history with AMTEC began initially in the 1980s when I worked for the National Film Board. Later, I was responsible for course and program development and distance education at Laurentian University and a PhD student at Concordia University in educational technology. And Chris is my co-host today. And Chris, why don't you introduce yourself and then we'll introduce our guest.
Sure. I'm Chris Crowley. I currently work at the University of British Columbia, where I manage a learning design team. My AMTEC history goes back to the 90s when I became, I guess my first involvement was as a Commonwealth Relations Trust bursar. And then after that, I became on board with the executive. And I was there for two terms, I think. And then since I've been in and out of my involvement with AMTEC, and now I'm heavily back involved now with this AMTEC History Project.
And the History Project was sort of an initiation of CNIE from the year when I was first president of CNIE and then later past president of CNIE. So, Chris, how about we introduce our guest now?
Okay. Today we are very, very pleased to have Ross Mutton, former AMTEC member. And Ross, maybe you can sort of fill us in on your background in education, what education sector you were working in, and maybe how you became involved in AMTEC.
So I was working at Carleton University. I started there in 71, and I was working in video production. We were doing a lot of video courses for students, particularly first-year students. And I was heavily involved with the Psych 100 course at that time, producing video, etc. So I was in the post-secondary sector. And my history with AMTEC starts in 1973, which is so it's right at the very beginning. I was actually at the first conference at Brock University where AMTEC was formed. I honestly don't remember a lot about that other than the fact that where we were and what was going on. I got involved because the people I worked for and with, particularly Ivan Barclay and June Landsberg, and June Landsberg had a long history with AMTEC and was very involved with AMTEC and became president at one stage. They were very supportive and, of something like an organization like AMTEC to get formed in Canada. So they were, because of their support and their interest in it, I ended up being at the first conference. And I did not attend the next couple. So the next time I was at AMTEC was in '76 when it was in St. John's, Newfoundland. And from that point forward, I think I was pretty well I was at virtually every AMTEC after that. I missed a couple along the way, but I went to most of the conferences from '76 on. And in '76, we landed in June in St. John's in the middle of a snowstorm. But it was a great conference, and discovered Newfoundland hospitality, but also started making a lot of acquaintances and contacts along the way. And I think, as Gar Fazard said, we had 4 seasons in 4 days. By the time AMTEC ended, it was like 30 degrees, like summer. It was an interesting start to a long history of AMTEC attendances.
I always, in all my time with AMTEC, I always hoped there'd be a conference in St. John's, and I never got to one in St. John's.
Yeah, and there were at least 2, if not 3, I think.
Oh, okay. Bad timing on my part.
I have to say, Ross, I was one of those students in Psych 100 in 1971 at Carleton University.
Uh-oh.
My introduction to psychology at university was through TV. It was a shock, but look what happened. I'm still doing that, right? So it was a positive shock, I think.
Wow.
And I did get an A, so it worked for me anyway.
So then you'll remember Bill Walther.
I remember the name. Yeah, but as students, you don't get to know the people behind the camera, right? But I remember the media unit at Carleton was very visible. You always saw them pushing equipment around, and a lot of those large first-year classes seemed to be moving into using television or using TV in the years that followed. I guess that Psych 100 experiment was a positive one.
Yeah, well, that led to an experiment with distance learning between Stanford and Carleton, which was probably, early to mid '70s. And then that led to the formation of what was called ITV, which was actually delivering courses via television over cable television into the city. And that started in '76 or '77, somewhere around there, and has evolved over the years and is now what's called CU Online.
Very cool name. So what do you think about AMTEC's importance related to educational technology? So you've already talked a little bit about the beginnings of educational technology at Carleton University. What about other places and AMTEC's involvement in other places?
Well, I think that's what AMTEC provided, because without AMTEC, we had really good connections within Ontario, within the post-secondary sector, but it didn't go beyond that. And so what AMTEC opened my eyes to was what was going on in other post-secondary and K-12 across the country. And I made a lot of contacts, some really good contacts with people in University of Saskatchewan and University of Calgary, and on the West Coast, with Al Lehman and Bruce McLean. So certainly Rick Schweer and Barry Brown and the Faculty of Education at the University of Saskatchewan were prime movers of all that. And the real thing that AMTEC provided beyond what we were going through is it dwelt on the application of educational technology. It wasn't just about what gizmos and what pieces of equipment would be best for working and produce educational television. It was, how do we use this technology to improve education and to be an adjunct to what is taught in the classroom, etc. And so we made a lot of contacts from coast to coast with people who were doing it, but also people who were studying it through the faculties of education, particularly at U of S and at the Memorial and I don't know, well, Concordia, so that was AMTEC became a forum where those things were discussed. There were presentations and papers on that. But moreover than that, we made a lot of contacts. And when the internet came along and electronic email and electronic connections started happening in the 90s, we were able to even form better contacts with those people on a more regular basis than just at a national conference once a year. And we'd already met a lot of these people. So the internet made a huge difference in the spread of communication and knowledge on the subjects that we were interested in.
Well, what do you think some of the key educational issues AMTEC had to address in your time, maybe especially in the early days? Like, what were the challenges around educational technology? And also later on, remember the 90s, you did a lot of copyright stuff, working with the new copyright legislation. And I remember you giving reports on what was happening in the federal government and such. And did AMTEC have much impact on those kind of processes?
So initially, AMTEC was the kinds of things that we were concerned about and challenges we faced were, first of all, the best application of the use of technology in education, in supporting courses and supporting learning and supporting the delivery of education. And then, of course, there were huge budget issues, over those years, and how to make all that happen with limited resources. And we all shared in that. Some provinces were better off than others, but in general, we had to deal with all of those kinds of issues. By the 90s, we started getting more involved in presentations to governments and studies, etc., like that. So I got involved with copyright because we were starting to run into all sorts of issues about what are the copyright issues with the use of video. Some of the things we did in the 70s were just absolutely out the window. I mean, nobody paid any attention to anything. They just, we would copy things and use them, and it was just, and then it would not fly today. So, but it was, I began to get more and more nervous about what we were doing, and so I started looking into copyright more and more seriously, and then I became quite involved with copyright. I appeared before the Senate subcommittee on copyright reform. And we also got involved in the information highway. And we also had Al LeBlanc and I did a presentation. He wrote it, I presented it, we co-wrote it, I should say, and I presented before the Ontario Royal Commission on Learning. And we talked about the use of technology in learning, and that was from K to 12 right through post-secondary. And it was well received because most of the presentations before that commission were about, teaching and learning issues and whatnot. When I came up, Kaplan his attention was almost, alerted and whatnot. And he said to me after the presentation that he was happy to hear something that was a little bit different from all the other presentations that we were talking about, the use of technology, and sparked some interest in the Royal Commission. So we had an impact with government, I would say from the 90s onward. And we were, invited to a number of areas where we were able to make our case.
So some of those copyright issues continue today. They haven't been all sorted out yet. People are more aware of the appropriate use of other people's work and appropriate attribution and so on. But the issues around payment of royalties and so on, those aren't completely settled yet, are they?
Not entirely. And there are various schools of thought about how that goes, but and CanCopy has been trying to say they are the be all and end all of clearing the rights for any of the printed materials, etc. But the truth is that the libraries have entered into all sorts of agreements with publishers that really, make CanCopy almost superfluous in some ways. So they've been very successful at lobbying the government. But the truth is that a lot of things have changed since the formation of CanCopy. And so there is a place for them, but it's not, the only and the main source of issues. The media copyright thing is really evolving. I mean, with the internet and the use of social media and the way people make use of materials, I would say there's an awful lot of fair dealing going on these days. So, and it could be argued that it is fair dealing. So, I mean, what people would think that was, not legal in the 90s, it's happening every day over the internet. And it's just a fact. And there's, you're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle, as they say.
So I'm just kind of wondering, what you were president of AMTEC for a term.
Yes.
What were any specific challenges you had at the time?
My recollection is things were going fairly well at that time. I mean, copyright was certainly one of the major issues at that, because I was president in the early 90s.
Okay.
So copyright was really starting to come to the fore when as I was president. But also I think, one of the things we struggled with was trying to grow the organization. And we just did not seem to be able to manage that. I mean, I think one of the things that I think I failed at, and we all failed at, was getting more involvement from the province of Ontario. Most of my colleagues just didn't seem to be interested in AMTEC, which I frankly did not understand. They seemed to be more dwelling on the technological side of things and not the application and learning side of things. So, Ontario, which had, more universities than any other province and more population than any other province, should have had more AMTEC members than any other province. And we might have, but nothing like what the demographics were. And we never seemed to be able to break that. I don't know. It seemed to me that Ontario was more of a force in the 70s and 80s in AMTEC than it was in the 90s and the 2000s.
It's ironic in a way, as the distance is greater, the connections are sometimes stronger. So if you mentioned Saskatchewan, and I live in Alberta, and you mentioned as well Memorial in Newfoundland. So there are strong connections to organizations that function as networks when they are farther away from maybe the center where you can actually drive and see people face to face. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, that did seem, I mean, I had as strong connections with people outside of Ontario as I did within. I mean, I saw the Ontario people, a couple of times a year, face to face.
Yeah.
But I would see the rest of them, once a year, face to face at an AMTEC conference. And I would get as much, if not more, out of those connections than I did with with the Ontario people.
Mhm.
So, and I mean, I got invited to a couple times out to the University of Saskatchewan to do presentations on either copyright or on issues around televised learning. And I got invited to Memorial to do a presentation on copyright. I got invited to several copyright colloquia that were run with the various Western universities between British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And would speak at those from time to time. And, those were always two-way streets because you would learn as much as you were able to share at those events. And all of that came about through the people I met at AMTEC.
Interesting, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you're mostly talking in the university sector. Can you recall colleagues in AMTEC who represented or came from college or K to 12, and did they experience some of the same things that you did in terms of these networks?
I would say so, yes. Certainly I met Al Lehman and Bruce McLean, and names are going to escape me. So, the woman from Langara College, I forget her name right now, isn't that awful? Anyway, so I met a number of people from the college sector in British Columbia, because the college sector was a little different in British Columbia.
Well, Marianne.
That's it, Marianne. Thank you. From Ontario colleges were a little different than British Columbia colleges. But also K to 12, met people from K to 12 in Ontario, and to some extent, Manitoba and places like that. The K to 12 issues were somewhat different, but there were still, there were cross cultivation issues along there. I mean, they were dealing more with school boards and, a wide number of schools over a large geographic area. Whereas we were talking about, a campus environment and reaching out to that. But, some of them were using video to overcome those miles and whatnot. So we had some common interests. And I was always interested in, learning from others, from people who were in education, but not necessarily in university. And that's where I differed from some of the people in the Ontario University sector. They just seemed to wanted to share with just the people that were doing the same thing that they.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's interesting that I think AMTEC provided that big network across Canada in terms of people connecting.
Yeah, I guess in some ways, I mean, it was a strength of AMTEC, but it also in some ways was a weakness of AMTEC because it was a more diverse group of people and of interest, and people who wanted to just focus on what they were doing and things that are, specific to their day-to-day operations, found I think a little bit too diverse. But I'm all for diversity.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Cindy.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you mentioned a wide range in the membership, and I think there were people from industry as well in the membership. And so did they contribute to that learning and learn themselves in that respect?
Yeah, we didn't have too many from industry. We had we certainly had one on our board when I was president. And but I mean, that industry he was in a company that was dealing with distance learning. So there was a connection. And I think, we learned some of the issues that they faced and vice versa. I remember, we were starting to talk about how to communicate with our membership electronically. And Dave Mappin from the University of Alberta and I were trying to convince this person from the private sector that we needed to start using the internet to make connections. And he was familiar with the Bell Envoy system, I think it was called, or something. It was some sort of electronic type of email. So his question to us was, well, who's in charge of the internet? And we had to try to explain to him that nobody was in charge of the internet. And he found that a baffling scenario from a private sector point of view. But he went and learned about that and he embraced it and started using it extensively. And so, I mean, that was a case where he picked up something from us, and as we had in the past from him.
There are also other, excuse me, government agencies involved. I think was it CNIE that did the cross Canada. Oh gosh, what was that project? But they are also a little bit involved in AMTEC.
Yeah, CNIE was involved in trying to establish the infrastructure to support the internet.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I was trying to, trying to get connectivity going, and that it would include into schools.
Okay.
I mean, schools, in the K-12 sector, a school was lucky if it had more than one phone. And here we are talking about trying to create an internet connection. So
Yeah.
A, they didn't have the connectivity, and secondly, they certainly didn't have the budget for doing all that. And at that time, I don't know what it's like today. I think, well, except that they all have, but the budget costs in those days for connectivity were substantial. And in many cases, you'd have to run a specific line.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when we first started doing video conferencing at Carleton, we had to spend considerable amounts of money for a special high-speed connection for video conferencing. And I mean, people would shake their heads and wonder what I'm talking about today, because it's things like Zoom and whatnot, where we're doing it almost over everything.
Oh,
it was special cameras as well, and special rooms with special setups. Very, very expensive just to set up one. And then the quality wasn't anything like what we're experiencing right now, right?
Well, that's true. I mean, if somebody wanted the video conference from one university to another, first of all, each university had to have the setup. And yes, they had to come to our room that we had set up for the video conferencing. It wasn't portable from room to room. So we established a room with classroom seating, so it could be used from one to another. And it had to all be scheduled and run by somebody. So it was a major undertaking in some ways, compared to what we do today. Is just, light years beyond. I have seen an awful lot of change of technology. I mean, I started in this field in, the late 60s. So the development of the technology over the years is just incredible.
yeah.
And I think, we still have a ways to go with how best to use it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the things AMTEC had was a journal, and it started even in the earlier days for sharing stories, I think, for supporting the networking and for sharing stories about successful practices. Am I right about that?
That's true. They were basically academic papers.
Mm-hmm.
So they were fairly high level. So I have to confess, I did not read a lot of the articles in the journal. I was more interested in what was in the media news.
Yeah.
Which was talking about some of the stuff that we were doing at our level. But there was I mean, there was a place for that because of the faculties of education that were involved with AMTEC. And so, it was important. I found I got most out of the sessions I would attend at the AMTEC conferences that could be related to those papers, because it was more interactive and we were allowed to ask questions about stuff that we didn't understand and delve into things and talk with other people about it. That's me.
Well, it's another type of sharing, from sort of theory to practice and practice back to theory. I remember when I worked with the National Film Board, and what I did essentially at AMTEC conferences was a media festival, show all the latest films that we'd identified as educational. So, a part of the day for K to 12 and a part of the day for young children and a part of a day for social development of communities and so on. And lots of people dropped in, didn't necessarily watch the films, but got information about them to consider the possibility of bringing film into the classroom.
Yes, thank you for reminding me of that, because I haven't even talked about the media festival. That was one of the highlights actually at the AMTEC conference. And I ran the media festival, I think in the first AMTEC conference we had in Ottawa, which was somewhere in the around 78 or 79, I guess it was. And so it was fascinating to see the material that other people were producing there, and there were some really high quality and innovative materials. And we had to evolve as time went on various categories and whatnot. I mean, initially we had things like slide tape presentations and video and film. And then we started getting into a number of interactive types of issues, and then eventually, learning packages. But it was always interesting to see the material. And the media festival presentation, would show clips out of these winners. And that would foster interest in going to see the media festival display area, where you could watch the entire unit if you wish to, if you could find the time. So that was a really good component of the conference. We also had a technical exhibitors, various suppliers of equipment would be at the conferences showing the latest technology. So that was of interest as well. But you're right, the media festival was really one of those key points. I don't know if that's continued with CNIE or not.
When we have had CNIE conferences in person, so we're now going back several years, right?
Yeah.
There's usually a festival of some sort. I don't think it's called, Chris, the one I remember most recently was at UBC. And it was more like an exhibitor showcase or something rather than a festival. Huh?
Yeah, there's no banquet and all that kind of, like when you think of the festival, there was the banquet and the presentations and the people coming up and accepting the award and the photographs. No, that's not. It's a bit of more of a showcase, I suppose. A lot of it's online now, so it's a much more passive experience, I think.
Right.
But that media festival reminds me, there was the involvement, like there was the Sony award, there was the Panasonic award. How did those relationships develop? Do you know? How were they brought on board, I suppose?
Yeah, well, that came through. I mean, the people that were bringing in the technology for the exhibits and whatnot.
Yeah.
So Sony and Panasonic were a couple of main sources of support. So I mean, they would showcase some of their equipment and some of their latest stuff, but they were also very supportive of AMTEC in general. We would usually we would either get donations from them to support the conference, or they would spend a fair amount of money on exhibit space that would support the conference, or both. And they became they were keenly interested in reaching the people that attended AMTEC, and so they were happy to sponsor, these awards that would go out in their name. So they would make a contribution to AMTEC, and we would, use their name on some specific awards that we gave out. So that's how that came about, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah, I remember at the banquets and the media festivals, that was the final awards were the big presentations, the Panasonic Award and Sony Award.
Yeah, and they would present them too. So.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
We seem to have covered a lot of our questions. One thing, the last question on the list was AMTEC's link to international organizations equivalents. And I don't know if you have any information on what sort of links we had out from Canada.
So AMTEC, I don't know at what stage this happened because I wasn't involved, but from, certainly before, it had to be at least back in the 80s, there seemed to be a linkage between AECT in the United States and AMTEC. And so I went to an AECT conference when I was president of AMTEC. I thought, it's something I should do as president, just because they would often send their president to our conferences, and we should do the same back. So that was the first time I guess I had attended an AECT conference. And it was eye-opening because it was a huge conference compared to AMTEC. I think there were something like 6,000 delegates or something crazy, and that's just, an amazing event. So, and there was, again, but the sessions and whatnot were a lot similar to what AMTEC was doing, to be honest. There was, it's just a lot more of them. And they also had an international group, that would form, they would meet at least once during the conference. And it was formed of people from other countries all over the world. And you would meet, and they would have a dinner and an auction of people would bring stuff from their countries, and they would have an auction of this material, and people would buy this stuff, and they would raise money for the group, etc. So it was a great time to meet people from other countries, excuse me, working in educational technology, and it was a lot of camaraderie and whatnot. So one of the times I went down, I took maple syrup, and I don't know, something else I forget, but I know I took maple syrup down, and the bidding on the maple syrup went on for quite some time. Particularly the people from Asia were just absolutely, nuts about trying to get some of this maple syrup. So that was our Canadian contribution.
So when I went to conference in the States, one of the things that always stood out to me was the size. I mean, they just dwarfed anything we did on this side of the border. But also in Western Canada, compared to what was happening in Western USA, I mean, their distance education model was more based on that remote classroom learning. They're all linked up through satellites, with remote campuses. Did you notice any differences in how Canadians were approaching educational technology, distance education, versus what was happening in the United States?
I think we were more aimed, at least, certainly the people I worked with across the country, we were more aiming at trying to get education right into the home, rather than make them go to, an education center. And the only time we would do something like that was when we got around to how to write the exams and things like that, where you had to have it probably properly monitored, etc., for cheating issues. So we tended to be a little more broad-based and whatnot. We would either have, educational television networks like OECA in Ontario, and I'm trying to remember the name of what it was called in Saskatchewan, but and they did the same in Nova Scotia, so that they were based on, a lot of the delivery was via either television or via cable. And so we were, a lot of the time going right into the home itself. So individual learning as opposed to group learning.
Yeah, I think that's the experience with the Knowledge Network out in BC, which started in the early
Yeah,
80s.
that's right. That's another one, yes.
Yeah, that's how my career started. We were doing telecourses for Knowledge Network.
And those routes, I mean, when I look at some of when I've been, pouring through some of the documents in the archives, I mean, that's the roots of all that were in the mid to late 60s in Canada, where there were broadcasters forming educational television networks.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the foundation of the knowledge network of OECA, which became TV Ontario,
Mm.
and the Saskatchewan network, etc. And there were those origins came from people who were working at the CBC and trying to foster
Well,
education over television.
wouldn't that be also like the National Film Board was kind of more also involved in that? So National Film Board, CBC, spinning off not spinning off, but gradually becoming things like Knowledge Network TV Ontario.
There was one in Alberta as well, although I don't know the name of it. I know that when I was in Saskatoon with the NFB, I did a 17-part cable series using NFB films, and it wasn't just the films, it was the introduction. And I invited, as I recall, university professors or specialists in whatever the topic was to come in. We'd have a conversation, introduce the film. They would show the film, and then we'd have a conversation afterwards. So a real educational use of the films. And that was on whatever the Saskatoon cable station was that I don't remember the name of either. There was a fair bit of that associated in Alberta. I think Athabasca University did some of its courses that way as well. But a long time before I came here. So probably in the time frame you're talking about, Ross, like maybe the late 80s and the 90s or something like that. Broadcast rather than internet delivered, right?
When I was doing the research for the foundations of AMTEC down at the archives, one of the things I ended up reading was Michael Oliver's presentation to AMTEC. Michael Oliver was the president of Carleton University in the mid-70s, I guess it was. And June Landsberg had obviously had an impact on what this was all about. But he came to AMTEC and he did a keynote presentation on how a fund should be established of national nature for which various producers across the country could apply to produce educational materials. And then that there should be I don't know whether I use the word clearinghouse, but there should be a repository where all of these could be documented and found and kept, that would be available to people across the country who were doing educational television. And so he made that proposal and challenged AMTEC to be involved in making that happen, but it never did. And I guess one of the things that we always, we don't have a national education structure in this country. It's every province has their own educational set, and that's one of the difference between the U.S. and Canada. I mean, the U.S. education is statewide, but they also have a national education group in the federal government who fosters the interconnections between all the 50 states and whatnot. We lack that in Canada. We don't have anybody, and I can't see that happening. Certainly not in the current political environment.
No.
And it's something that's, you know, we haven't made the best. We haven't seized the opportunities that would be there to make that happen.
I don't really have any more questions, Cindy. You're muted.
Myself, sorry about that. Is there anything else you can think of that we should know? I mean, you've hinted a couple of times at your exploration of the archives, and so maybe we could just state that part of this AMTEC History Project is to pull together as much material as we can and then to make it available. And you've done some investigative work for us in that regard. Is there anything else you think that we could say today that will help, I don't know, any viewers understand more or understand where to go for more information about AMTEC and its value to the country?
Well, I think AMTEC, you know, was a foundation. It was the first time that we ended up with actually a national group in this country dealing with educational technology. Before that, there were various subgroups of you know, province-wide and whatnot, but there was no national group, and that was what was envisioned when 3 organizations amalgamated back in the early 70s to form AMTEC, and so it became a national organization. And you know, it's CNIE has taken that mantle forward, and so it's important that continue as much today as any day. But AMTEC was the foundation for making that happen. After that, the predecessor to CNIE is
CADE.
CADE, yes. CADE did the same thing with distance education.
Yeah.
And focused on distance education. It could really have all happened under AMTEC umbrella, but it didn't. It formed that way. So it's a good thing to see that eventually AMTEC and CADE came together, because they probably should have been all along. And I would, you know, hope that CNIE is able to continue that and move forward with that in the future. But that AMTEC is one of those tree trunks, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So Cindy, did you want to?
Well, yeah, I do want to say thank you, Ross Mutton, for your time and your energy today, for joining us and sharing your stories, and mentioning a few other names of people that we can contact who get other stories about what AMTEC did for Canada, for education in Canada. And we really wanted to thank you for joining us on this video journey. And we want to say to our audience to join us for another interesting conversation coming up on the history of educational technology in Canada. So thank you all very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Ross.
Good.
See you.
Take care. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome. It's fun.
Good.
All right. Now I'm going to stop recording.